You can support In the Past Lane by telling your friends about the podcast. Studies show that one of the top ways that people find new podcasts is by word of mouth. So please, talk it up. Thanks. At some point early on during the Watergate investigation, President Richard Nixon quipped to an aide that his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was an insurance policy against him ever being impeached. His point was that Agnew, who was widely known for his belligerence and rumored to be thoroughly corrupt, was so despised by the Washington establishment that they would never remove Nixon from office, because that would make Agnew president. But then, Agnew's past caught up with him, and when he was hit with multiple charges of accepting bribes while governor of Maryland and as vice president, he opted to resign on October 10th, 1973. Suddenly, Nixon's impeachment insurance was gone, and 10 months later, as impeachment proceedings against him started, Nixon resigned. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 160, in which we take a deep dive into the history of impeachment. We are brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and come to you this week from the Blue Dress Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Our executive producer is a woman of unimpeachable character, Lulu Spencer. So what's happening at In the Past Lane this week? Well, summer continues to fly by. Here in New England, the weather has been mostly fantastic, with the only complaint that some days have been what we call scorchers, mid-90s and super humid. I've had a chance to hit the beach a few times, and will soon be spending a whole week at the beach with my family, plus those of my many brothers and sisters. Over the years, we've grown to about 40 people, and we're renting 4 houses on Good Harbor Beach in Gloucester, my hometown. We've done this for the past 15 years or so, and it's a blast. And this year, we'll have a sizable contingent of young people on hand, so I'm looking forward to dusting off my sandcastle building skills. Keep an eye out on Twitter and Instagram for some photos. In other news, I had a pretty cool opportunity a few weeks ago to film 4 episodes with Peter Sagal of NPR's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me show. He is as funny in person as he is on his show, and we had a great time doing the shoot. It's for a new show that's going to be called History, but with a $sign for the S in history, which is to indicate the underlying theme of the show, which is how money is always a key element in historical events. So, for example, one episode was on Watergate, the scandal that gave us the phrase, follow the money. The show will debut sometime in the fall, and I'll have more details as it approaches. Also, you have got to check out our new and improved lineup of t-shirts and other merchandise. We've redesigned some t-shirts and added a whole bunch more, like one with the quotation, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." And one of our most popular shirts with the following, "Dear America, okay, I'm begging you. Stop repeating this shit. Signed, History." And because you asked for it, a t-shirt emblazoned with one word, huzzah. Seriously, you got to check it out. And all these things at inthepastlane.com. Just click on merchandise. Finally, some of you informed me recently that the PayPal donation button was not working. Well, I fixed it, and just like that, Bob K. made a $100 donation. Thanks so much, Bob. This is great support. And thanks to all of you who support the podcast with single donations using the PayPal button or by becoming a monthly supporter via Patreon. You'll find both options at inthepastlane.com. Just click on support. Thanks. Okay, people, dust off your copies of the Constitution, because we're heading down the road to impeachment. By which I mean, of course, the history of impeachment. Your journey in the past lane begins now. There's been a lot of talk about impeachment over the last 2 years. And while it remains unclear if the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives will commence impeachment proceedings against President Donald Trump, this seems like a superb moment to do an episode on the history of impeachment. To help us make sense of this rarely used constitutional procedure, I'm joined today by historian Jeffrey Engel, co-author of a new book, Impeachment: An American History. Jeffrey Engel is a historian and director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University in Texas. He is the author of many books on U.S. political history and the presidency, including The Four Freedoms, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Evolution of an American Idea, and When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. In the course of our discussion, Jeffrey Engel explains why the founders' fear of potential abuse of power by a president or high government official led them to include an impeachment provision in the U.S. Constitution, why the founders made a key distinction between maladministration, essentially doing a bad job as a president, and actions taken by the president that could harm the nation. Only the latter required impeachment. How the founders meant by high crimes and misdemeanors actions that might not be technically illegal, but are judged to be harmful to the nation. Why Republicans decided to impeach President Andrew Johnson in 1868, and how Johnson's own actions and personality played a key role in his near removal from office. What President Richard Nixon did to merit the commencement of impeachment proceedings against him, a process he avoided by resigning. How, in the aftermath of Watergate, Congress changed the rules to allow future special prosecutors investigating alleged presidential wrongdoing greater freedom and independence. And how that reform had the unintended consequence of leading to the wide-ranging investigation of President Clinton that started with a sketchy land deal in Arkansas and ended up focused on an affair between the president and a 22-year-old intern named Monica Lewinsky. And in turn, how that experience led to new rules that restricted the independence of special prosecutors, leading to the current-day complaints by some that Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller was not allowed to fully investigate the many charges against President Trump. And finally, what it means that we might soon witness the third impeachment effort in the last 50 years, after having only one impeachment in the first 185 years of the nation's history. Jeffrey Engel, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Hi, good to talk to you.
All right, well, my first question for you about your book, Impeachment: A History, is I'm sure there's an interesting origin story behind the book, because someone picking this book up in a bookstore might think, wow, what amazing fortuitous timing on the part of these authors to have come up with a book about impeachment when that's all people seem to be talking about. Or it's a book that was inspired by all of that talk, and you guys managed to churn it out fairly quickly. So what's the backstory to the book?
It was that second story, actually. We were inspired. It actually was something which was created wholly within the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. We were having one of our routine fellows and faculty get-togethers, gabbing about what we think is important in the field and who we should invite in the next couple of years to speak. And someone said, I wonder what the history of impeachment could tell us about all this talk of impeachment we keep hearing.
Right.
And the more we started talking about it, the more I said, this not only should be more than a lecture series. This should be a book. This is something that people are really, I think, as someone who thinks you need history in order to understand the present and hopefully the future, we need some good basic history on what happened in previous iterations and what happened in the 1800s and in the 1900s to give us a sense of what we can expect going forward. And then, frankly, it was just a race to get it done. In fact, I think the editor at our press said that she had heard of faster books, but she had never worked on one.
Well, that's good. And you also went with the division of labor idea, which is to have 4 writers rather than a single person. That, in some ways, probably sped the process up a little bit.
Oh, tremendously. In fact, what we usually do for these types of things is come up with a list of the 3 or 4 people who we think would be best for each topic when we don't want to do a division of labor like that. And I was just thrilled to report that in each case, the first person we had and the first person we wanted for each of those categories immediately said yes. So that was actually a very quick process in itself.
That's great. It's probably in some ways a measure of the shared interest in this topic, that people are very keenly aware that it's a topic that needs some exploring in our current moment.
Exactly. I keep saying, and it's absolutely true, I've done 12 books now, and this is the first time that nobody has ever asked me, why would you want to study that?
It's a good point. Good point. Well, I think one thing that our listeners would really benefit from is some kind of I think everybody kind of thinks they know basically what impeachment is, but maybe you could take us all the way back to the founding period and sort of give us an impeachment 101.
Sure.
The relevant part of the Constitution, Article 2, Section 4 says, The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So why did they phrase it that way? And also, what are they worried about? What are the founders worried about? And why do they include this, this mechanism in the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, what they're afraid of is actually what they had just gone through, which is to say we have to remember that the Constitution, of course, was developed in the shadow of the American Revolution, a revolution that for patriots, for colonials, was framed very much as a war against tyranny. And they understood that a tyrant could arise whenever you have somebody given power, because their very conception of power is that whoever has it is going to want more. And they didn't necessarily consider that a bad thing. It was just a part of human nature. This is why we have a separation of powers within the Constitution. In fact, I like to think of it more as a competition of powers, which is to say every single element of the government, by naturally trying to grab more power, will check the other ones. And their big fear was what happens if somebody gets into the executive branch who is either excessive in their accumulation of power or dangerous in their utilization of power. That is to say, somebody who in some way isn't just a bad president, but a dangerous president, someone who is hurting the body politic. And in fact, part of their discussion, I think this is actually the most insightful part of the entire impeachment process that we need to understand as going forward as Americans. Part of their discussion was a rejection of something which was actually a basis for impeachment in many of the state constitutions at the time, impeaching of governors in that case, which was the phrase and term maladministration, or bad administration, if you will. Basically, what they said was maladministration is not a good reason to impeach somebody. Just because you're bad at your job doesn't mean you should be removed. The voters will take care of that in all due course. And just because we disagree with your policies is not a reason to remove you. If you're doing your best, you stay in until the voters say get out. However, if somebody goes further, treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors, and a high crime being understood by them universally as a crime against the people, against the state, against the interest of the body politic, something that harms the very soul of the nation, that is a person who needs to be removed immediately. Because that is a person who is quite dangerous.
Yeah, and they have George III in mind. As you say, they're very much a product of their context, and they're thinking that they have recent experience with an abusive leader.
Exactly. And in fact, foreign influence is one of the things that they were particularly concerned about. It's absolutely both fascinating and prescient, and in fact, a little bit eerie, to be honest, to read through the constitutional debates and look at the reasons that were given for possible reasons that we might want to impeach a president. For example, one of the reasons given was, well, what if they came to office having lied in their ascent to power, having fabricated their campaign. They didn't use the word campaign, of course, that's our word, but having fabricated the way they came into office. Well, they said, well, of course, then they should be impeached. Well, what if somebody were perhaps to find themselves under the influence of a foreign power, including what if somebody were to find themselves monetarily under the influence of a foreign power, and they universally said, well, that person should be impeached. And it went even further. What if somebody begins to talk about using their pardon power in order to hide a criminal activity? And they said, well, then that person should be impeached. I mean, every single thing which, frankly, the president today is accused of, we don't need to have a discussion necessarily of whether he's guilty or not, but accused of, are the very things that the founders explicitly said were rationales for impeachment.
Yeah, it is fascinating and eerie. So that's a really important background on like what they were thinking and what they were worried about. But it's often one of the phrases we hear today is that impeachment is not a legal process. It's a political process. So could you tell us a little bit more about that? And that also was on the other side of, there are people in favor of the impeachment mechanism, but there's also some people that were worried about it, thinking that it could be a vehicle for abuse as well.
Well, and they were very much worried about legislative tyranny as much as executive tyranny, the founders, and that they were concerned that the legislature might be the one that really would begin to accumulate too much power. So they were deadly concerned about having a legislature overstep its bounds and remove a president for no particularly good reason. But the truth is, at the end of the day, this is a political process, and I don't quite understand in American society today why there is a taint or a distinction that we make with a political process that's somehow dirty or unclean. Politics is what these people did. Politics is the nature of government. They made a big distinction by using the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, that one does not need to commit an actual on-the-books crime in order to be guilty of a high crime. I mean, a regular crime, if you will, is a crime where property is destroyed or where you harm some other individual and the state has laws that adjudicate that. A high crime, it doesn't have to be a crime. It can be something where we just never thought that a person would do that to their own country. Mm-hmm. And that's a person who is dangerous. And that is by itself a political decision. In fact, I also need to point out it's entirely possible, in fact, in these, for the last decades, not unlikely, that a president will break some law, will commit a crime, and nobody would think that that was impeachable. My favorite example is a president who is convicted of jaywalking. Mm-hmm. Does anybody in a reasonable frame of mind think jaywalking is an impeachable offense? No, of course not. So what they really were concerned about were not crimes on the books, but crime in a broader moral sense.
Yeah, very interesting. And so the mechanism is embedded in the Constitution, and there is some concern on both sides regarding it. But the interesting thing is, 80 years goes by before, through very tumultuous political times, as books by like Joanne Freeman and others, of recent times have pointed out, it's not until 1868 that impeachment becomes a possibility and then an actual event. So maybe we should shift to the troubled administration of Andrew Johnson and this first use of impeachment against a president.
I was going to say, actually, I think one of the most insightful cases for understanding impeachment, and this will just reinforce one of the points we've already been discussing, was discussion of impeachment during the presidency of John Tyler, who, of course, was the first vice president to come to power upon the death of the president. And he came up with this novel idea, which seemed novel to him, novel to people at the time, but obvious to us because he set the precedent, that a president, when they become president, is the president. That is to say, he took office and believed that he was charged, therefore, with doing the office the best way he thought, not necessarily fulfilling the mandate or the program of his predecessor. You can imagine that his original cabinet were not too pleased with this. Right. They wanted them to follow the mandate of the person who had been elected. And so there was some discussion of impeachment. Perhaps we might get rid of the president for not following party line, if you will. But again, the discussion ended once people came to the conclusion that, well, that's not what it's for. It's for someone who is doing bad to the country. Nobody at the time was suggesting that Tyler was somehow harming the country. They just didn't like what he was doing. And there's a really important distinction to be made there.
And then we jump ahead a few more decades. Yeah. We get to the real thing with Andrew Johnson, who assumes the presidency from Abraham Lincoln after his assassination. And Johnson, he's an odd person, and he's in a really odd position, in the sense that he's not really a Republican, and he really doesn't believe in the Republican vision of post-Civil War America. So tell us how that starts to unravel for him.
Well, Johnson has three fundamental flaws as he assumes office. The first is he's not Abraham Lincoln, which is no small thing, because Lincoln had actually placed him on the ticket in many ways as a reconciliation gesture to Democrats and even to the South in some ways, anticipating the end of the war. Johnson had been the only Democratic senator in office at the time of secession who stayed in office, who did not leave with the South. He thought the Union was more important. But at the same time, he had what we might understand to be Southern sensibilities, which leads to his second problem, which is that he, again, acting as a president as he thought best, just did not believe in the Republican agenda of what we would call today civil rights, of dismantling the slavery institutions. He genuinely was, I think fair to say, and this is a big statement, the single most racist person to ever occupy the White House. He just did not believe fundamentally that African Americans could be or should be proper citizens, and therefore ran directly against, in a sense, the party that had elected him and the party that had, or I should say put him in office, and the party that had control of Congress at the time. So from the very beginning, he butted heads politically with the cabinet and the administration and then the Congress, which were in place and expected to follow Abraham Lincoln's lead. And then, of course, Johnson had a third fundamental problem. This might be the biggest problem of all. He was a real jerk.
He was.
And if this wasn't for public discussion, I would use a stronger word than jerk. Which is to say he was an unpleasant person who went out of his way to be unpleasant, it seemed, had no natural constituency. I still can't fathom how he rose up through the ranks of politics. And as a consequence, when push came to shove and people disagreed with his policies or people disagreed with his agenda or disagreed with the way that he was conducting himself in office, there was no one to turn around and say, yeah, but he's our guy.
Right.
Let's just hold our noses on this and push forward. And finally, ultimately, he is impeached with only a few months left to go in the office when the Republican Congress basically couldn't stomach the idea of him staying in office one day more.
Right. Rather than run out the clock, they went for it. And ultimately, the Senate acquits him by one vote. But so it's a narrow vote. And there's a story behind how that vote is so narrow. But it is the first full-on impeachment, and it fails to remove him. And then another 100 years goes by, which is another interesting thing. So this rarely used instrument continues to be rarely used. It's talked about periodically. And we then get to a very different Republican president, Richard Nixon, in the early 1970s. And his situation is very different from Johnson's, because Johnson's dispute with his fellow Republicans was about policy, and they could make the argument that it was about, breaking the law and such. But Nixon is clearly engaged in criminal activity and a criminal effort to cover it all up. So it's a very different situation. So tell us what's going on in 1973-74 with Nixon.
Well, Nixon is the one of the three cases that we studied in the book, the third, of course, we'll get to, being Bill Clinton, whom historians, by and large, I have not met a historian who thinks Nixon was innocent.
Right.
I think historians largely agree that Johnson should not have been impeached because, again, he was guilty of maladministration more than of actual high crimes and misdemeanors. And same for Bill Clinton, that what he did, most historians today agree, while breaking the law in a minor way, was not a high crime. Not the same with Richard Nixon. Nixon was involved in the Watergate Break-In, which was an attempt by his operatives to find out information on his political opponents. The break-in, we should remember, was at the Democratic National Headquarters, and it was really designed in order to help Nixon get dirt on his rivals to help him in his re-election campaign.
Right.
And basically, the next 2 years are an unraveling of the ball of yarn that Nixon had tried to wrap around the break-in to protect himself. That is to say, he went out of his way to cover up what he had done, and more importantly, to cover up that he knew about the break-in, and more importantly, to cover up that he knew about the cover-up of the break-in. And ultimately, this led to him lying to the American people. This led to him refusing to give information and documents to Congress as part of their investigation. And then finally, when evidence appeared that, frankly, no reasonable person could question, that is to say, something we call the famous smoking gun tape appeared, which was a tape in which people could hear with their own ears the president saying on the tape, "Here's how we're going to get out of this crime." Once irrefutable evidence arose, his popularity plummeted. So, people who were partisan, people who were Republicans, people who were Nixon supporters were willing to basically toe the party line and say the president is being accused in a witch hunt fashion, a phrase that they used quite frequently at the time, and until the evidence became irrefutable, at which point his popularity among Republicans in particular just falls off a cliff. And basically, within a week, he's out of office.
Right. What's interesting about revisiting it, if you read Timothy Naftali's chapter in your book, or dive a little into the sort of the sound version of this, which is the Slow Burn podcast, which, was a great revisiting of the whole saga. The thing that jumps out to most people, I think, is how long Watergate played out, how long it took for, all the investigations, all the public hearings, and how much public opinion didn't move until a couple of critical moments, one being the Saturday Night Massacre in October of 73, and then the other, as you say, being the release of the tapes, and in particular the smoking gun in August of 1974. That's an interesting thing that people sometimes point to now, like people who are looking at the impeachment question in 2019. There's a certain sense of frustration that in their minds that things aren't moving, and others saying, well, if you look back to Watergate, it actually took a long time for the whole thing to play out.
Exactly. And I think that we have a natural expectation, because we want things to be understandable in terms of what happened before, in terms of precedents, because that's how human brains are constructed. We want whatever is going on today to unravel like Watergate. And the truth is, what we learn from this book is that every single impeachment case was distinct and was different. So, of course, there are going to be similarities. There's the similarity that, Nixon was not necessarily a popular president with the other side, much like Johnson or Clinton. Nixon did, on the other hand, play things out very long in a way that we're seeing today. So we remember what Nixon was ultimately accused of and what articles of impeachment have been approved in the House Judiciary Committee for him, his impeachment would have been inevitable. I really can't find anybody who disagrees with that. And most likely his conviction in the Senate as well. So we actually refer to him as, sort of the special case because he, among the three, was the only president to not be impeached, yet to leave office because of the impeachment process.
Right. And had he been impeached, as you point out, probably would have been found guilty.
I'm hard-pressed to think that there's any way that he would not have been found guilty.
Right. In, Greek tragedy-like form, he recorded everything so that he's, his own worst enemy, brings himself down in that kind of spectacular manner. And then what's interesting from that point on is that to a degree, in the aftermath of Watergate, there's a lot of questions about what do we need to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or if it happens again, we need better processes because a lot of this was being made up as it went along. And it seems that some people think that the idea of a special prosecutor or whatever the proper term is, there's a real belief that that person needs to be given certain powers and be, in the legal sense, have broad jurisdiction, be able to conduct an unimpeded investigation if such an investigation ever is deemed necessary. And Congress decides that it is necessary in the case of Bill Clinton in the late 1990s. And that gives the investigators, this new legal framework, tremendous latitude. And what starts out as a investigation into maybe a sketchy land deal turns out, exposing this affair and then leading to impeachment. So tell us a little bit more about that part of the puzzle. The interim period between Watergate and Clinton is an interesting development.
Yeah, I have no idea what's going to happen after whatever we want to term this political moment that we're in, except for one thing. I guarantee you that there is going to be a reevaluation and a rewriting of the special prosecutor or the prosecutor's office or whatever they're going to call it. There's going to be some reformation of this office that is ultimately available if the president needs to be investigated, because there was a complete reformation of it after Watergate, and then there was a complete reformation of it after the Clinton impeachment. In the former case, giving the prosecutor more power, and then ultimately after the Clinton case, there was a general assessment among Republicans and Democrats that they had given that office too much power. So with the next case, we will learn lessons from this and apply it to the next case, and I guarantee that next case is going to cause a reformation after that next case.
Right.
But one of the things to remember about the broad picture of the formation of the special prosecutor's office and also the aftermath of Watergate is that it's part of a broader moment in American history of political unease and political untrust. That is to say, this is a period in American history where people really begin to doubt and mistrust the government as being, if nothing else, forthright and honest. Mm-hmm. We're in the wake of the Watergate scandal, of course. We're also in the wake of the Vietnam War. We're also in the wake, and I think this is equally important, of the hearings in the Senate led by Senator Church that were designed to ferret out and reveal, frankly, much of what the American intelligence services, the CIA especially, had done that was either illegal or at the very least inappropriate in American eyes. Mm-hmm. They get their own series of reforms imposed upon them, the intelligence community. But when you put this all in a package together, what you get in the mid-'70s and early '80s is a real sense among Americans that more transparency is needed and better. In fact, I would argue that's one of the fundamental reasons why Jimmy Carter wins election in 1976, is that he's able to portray himself as the antidote to what ails Washington. And what ailed Washington at that time was that it was a swamp of mistrust. So the prosecutor, who is ultimately appointed to investigate some, as you said, rightly, sketchy land deals that the Clintons were involved in, ultimately winds up pursuing things completely beyond that question. That is to say, his office had a mandate to keep investigating, frankly, till they found something.
Yeah.
And I think the psychology of the group and of the office is really important, because this is a group that had a very high-motivated, highly intelligent, high-achieving people who were put in an office and told to find something on the president, essentially, and they kept going till they did. And it ultimately didn't matter to them that what they were charging the president with, which was not properly discussing illegally, in a legal sense, an extramarital affair, that was reason enough to impeach the president, or at least to bring shame upon the president, because he had done this illegal thing, which they only found out about because they were investigating something entirely different from where they started.
Right. The very definition of a fishing expedition, at least in the eyes of the critics of Kenneth Starr and his office. And there's a real cultural component to it as well. We can look back on it and really see that to conservative Americans, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton seem to represent something quite nefarious to them in terms of American values and culture. And so there was certainly Ken Starr and lots of people in his office were ideologically motivated, kind of repulsed by Clinton, and decided that was also reason to keep going.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, you used the term fishing expedition, which is the term we commonly use. But I think in this case, we have to remember that we normally think of fishing as done with a single pole. This is fishing as you might do in the deep sea with a massive net.
Yes.
That is to say, trying to cover up whatever comes up. And a lot of garbage is going to come up when you fish that way. And the Clintons were, from the moment that they ran for office the first time, and I use the word they there because they packaged themselves in many ways as a political team, Bill and Hillary Clinton. They were under suspicion of being distrustful people. Bill Clinton, who may have been the most talented politician of our times, had a remarkable ability to obfuscate, to dissemble, to not entirely tell the full truth when he was trying to get out of a political problem. This had occurred when he was running for election, when it became not necessarily clear that he had in some form or fashion dodged the draft during the Vietnam War, but at the very least had not been fully forthright in the ways that he, like so many others, had anxieties about going and tried to figure out how they could not go. By the same token, at that time it was considered a deadly sin for a politician to have tried marijuana. And Bill Clinton tried to get out of that by saying, well, I tried it, but I didn't inhale.
Yeah.
So he never was willing to say, yes, I did something, which always led someone to believe, his opponents especially, to believe that there was always something else there. In fact, one of the great moments of that period, I think, is during the Oscars when Billy Crystal, who was hosting the Oscars that year, simply turned to the camera and said, didn't inhale. And everyone laughed uproariously,
right.
And because it was such a ludicrous idea. And so the Clintons came in basically with a shadow of being uncouth, of being from, frankly, a non-cosmopolitan state, Arkansas, and of being shifty. And I think you can make the argument, I would make the argument, that they represent a fundamental shift in the way Americans understand the presidency writ large, which is that before Clinton, presidents were opposed, at least during the Cold War era. Presidents were opposed, but they weren't necessarily hated. They weren't necessarily reviled. After Clinton, every single president has had a component of his opposition that just hates his guts.
Right.
And in an irrational way, in many ways. It's a mind-bending and critically important transformation of the way that we understand the presidency writ large. And that begins with Bill Clinton's basic lack of trustability.
Yeah, and maybe that's the way we can jump to our final segment here, where I always ask the people that I interview about how this matters now. It's pretty obvious, but one thing that seems to be clear is that the media landscape is quite different, so that perhaps what's contributing to that kind of visceral hatred of the president by a chunk of the population, no matter who the president is this new splintered and fairly extreme kinds of media that are out there. Is that how you read it?
I do, and I think if you combine both the transformation of the way Americans conceive of their political opponents with the siloing effect of today's media, that is to say everyone basically having enough choices in media that they wind up choosing sources that reconfirm what they already believe, what that basically does is it gets people dividing themselves up, not necessarily by what they believe, but who they hate. And then the media, through no fault of its own, they're a natural part of this process, by giving people more and more information that confirms their bias in a silo, basically is adding fuel to the fire of the anger on every side constantly. So I think the transformation that occurs with Clinton in how we view the presidency as being in some ways to his opponents illegitimate, well, frankly, that is catalyzed 1,000 times by the way in which we can find other people to agree with us all the time.
Yeah.
And it makes us also think anyone who doesn't agree with us doesn't just have the wrong facts, they're wrong in the head.
Right. And somehow a threat to all that is good. And it seems to me one question as we widen the lens and look at impeachment, it's obviously a topic of great discussion these days on lots of levels, whether it's the practical part or the political part. But is it concerning that we look and we think impeachment wasn't used for the first 80 years of the Republic. Then it was used against Johnson. Then another more than 100 years go by before it's employed or nearly employed against Richard Nixon. But if you look from the early 70s to now, that's about 40 years, 45 years. And if there's impeachment proceedings brought against President Trump, that would be 3 impeachments in 50 years, less than 50 years. It seems like that's not what the founders had in mind.
It's not, and the slope of the line is clearly going up. Although I like to point out 2 things. The first is I really do believe that each of these cases is individually motivated at its heart. Mm-hmm. That is to say, there really was not discussion of impeaching Barack Obama. There really was not discussion genuinely of impeaching George W. Bush. Yes, you could find voices on the margins who called for those things, but you can always find voices on the margins calling for all kinds of crazy things.
Right.
There was no general sense that there was reason for it. What is more disturbing to me, and disturbing to the point that it makes me question the viability of our system without radical change, is not that Donald Trump has been discussed with the word impeachment from the very beginning, but I contend that if Hillary Clinton had won the election, that there would have been just as likely impeachment against her.
Right.
Remember, she would have come into office with a Republican Congress, a Republican House in particular, whose convention, the war cry had been lock her up.
Mm-hmm.
I am hard-pressed to think that given the opportunity to investigate and impeach the president, that the Republican rabid Congress that came into office in opposition to her wouldn't have taken that opportunity. Now, I don't think in any way, shape, or form, barring some revelation of new information, that she would have been convicted. But I do think that whoever won the 2016 election, impeachment was going to hang over them, and that in itself is a troubling idea.
Right.
But I contend that's because of the unique attributes of each candidate. That is, Hillary Clinton was hated like no other by her opponents, and so is Donald Trump. I think a less personally, well, frankly, catalyzing and offensive personality would not have generated the same impeachment zeal.
Right. And in the case of Hillary Clinton, certainly there a long, many decades long opportunity to develop that kind of enmity towards her. So, yeah, we are in interesting times. We have a potential constitutional crisis on our hands, and if the election had gone the other way, we would very likely have a very different kind of constitutional crisis, or at least using rarely used instruments. Well, Jeffrey Engel, this has been a great conversation and really enlightening about an incredibly important topic. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane.
Oh, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Jeffrey Engel is the co-author of Impeachment, An American History, published by Modern Library and available everywhere that books are sold. You can follow Jeffrey Engel on Twitter at Jeffrey A. Engel. And if you want to learn more about Watergate and the impeachment of Bill Clinton, I highly recommend that you check out the podcast Slow Burn. It's fantastic. And even though I'm a historian and I lived through those events, I was blown away by how much I learned. Season 1 focuses on Watergate, and Season 2 on the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, any tips for our listeners for dealing with the summer heat?
Vodka.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.